Thanks for coming today. Welcome to the FCC. My name is Jennifer Jett. I'm a correspondent governor here and Asia digital editor at NBC News. Before we begin, just a reminder to please silence your phones. Also, yeah, I think those are all my announcements. Let's get into it. We're here today because last week was the 50th anniversary of the Fall of Saigon, and we have an excellent lineup of speakers here who are here to tell us about their own experiences and the experiences of other FCC members as well. So let me start by introducing our speakers. To my right here, we have Kees Metselaar, a Dutch photojournalist who was based in Hong Kong off and on from 1989 to 2021. Like all of our speakers, a longtime FCC member. During his career, he has covered some of the biggest events in Asia, including the Soviet-Afghan War, the falls of President Marcos in the Philippines and President Suharto in Indonesia, and the 2004 Asian tsunami. He also specializes in digital asset management, especially the setting up of image databases, and is in charge of the Hugh van Es archive, which we'll be talking about later. And he's now based in Amsterdam. Next, we have Edie Lederer, who has worked on every continent except Antarctica during her more than 50-year career with the Associated Press, covering wars, disasters, political upheavals, and more. She was the first woman assigned to cover the Vietnam War full-time for AP and was also the news agency's first female bureau chief overseas in Lima, Peru, and was also based in Hong Kong from 1978 to 1981. Edie is currently AP's chief correspondent at the United Nations, a role that she has held for 25 years. Last but not least, we have another FCC legend, Hugh van Es, who was married to a Dutch photojournalist, Hugh van Es, who we all know very well, from 1969 until his death in 2009. She spent most of her career working for a major multinational corporation, taking charge of opening up the China market and retiring as sales and marketing director for Southeast Asia. So I'll start off with a few questions, and we're going to be looking at some of Hugh's photos as well, but we'll also have time at the end for audience Q&A, so please do start thinking about your questions. So Edie, let's start with you. You were just in Ho Chi Minh City last week for the anniversary.
Right.
Could you tell us a bit about what that was like and how these commemorations or reunions of journalists have evolved over the years?
Thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak about Vietnam 50 years after the end of the war. Just to give you a very brief synopsis of my time in Vietnam, I was lucky enough to be there before, during, and after the pullout of the last American combat troops, which happened at the end of March in 1973. And as I'm sure you all know, the United States turned over the fighting of the Vietnam War to the South Vietnamese Army and stopped funding the war. And 2 years later, on April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell to the combined North Vietnamese and Viet Cong armies. And for the Vietnamese, April 30th is Liberation Day. It marks the reunification of the country. And this 50th anniversary was the largest that I know of. And I've been to quite a number of them. The Horst Voss, AP's Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, and I, and Nick Ut, and several other journalists came back to Vietnam for the first time in 1973. And we met in Phnom Penh.
You mean 93, probably. 93.
93,
Yeah,
sorry.
No problem.
1993, 20 years after I left. And it was right after the United Nations had come into Cambodia with peacekeeping troops. And that enabled us to fly to Siem Reap to go to Angkor Wat. We flew back to Phnom Penh and drove to the Vietnamese border, where Nico met us in a van, and we drove to Old Saigon and all the way up Highway 1 to Hanoi. It's the first time I had ever been to the north. I'm telling you this because out of that trip, that vacation, Horst and I decided that the 20th anniversary of the end of the war was coming up 2 years later on April 30th, 1995. And we decided that we were going to do a reunion in Ho Chi Minh City for correspondents who had covered the war. And we sort of collected a list. We had no idea, certainly no connection with the government. We just announced that we were going to meet on the rooftop of the Rex Hotel on April 28th at like 6 o'clock for drinks. And more than 50 correspondents showed up. And that was the beginning of the reunions that we and another of our colleagues did for the 20th, the 25th reunion, where over 100 people, correspondents showed up. Annie believes that the 30th was even bigger. And there was the 35th. For the 35th, the Vietnamese government, as we were leaving, came and said, would those of us who were still there like to meet some of the Vietnamese correspondents who covered the war that night for dinner? And so maybe a dozen of us went for the 35th. For the 40th, the government actually did an event for the returning war correspondents, and not just from the United States. This was from all over Europe and, Asia. And so, of course, we were all planning for the 45th reunion, but then COVID intervened. So there was no 40th reunion. And I'm telling you this because there has not been a reunion for 10 years. And so you have a whole new generation of young Vietnamese. And Vietnam has a very, very young population. And I am telling you, I believe every single Vietnamese in Ho Chi Minh City, and people came down from the north, came for this celebration, this 50th anniversary of what they see as their liberation and the unification of the country. So it was very, very joyous. And the government put on a 5-day program for the journalists who came back. Very extensive. Going to see the new Vietnam, old spots. We went to the War Remnants Museum and saw all of the old photos from, some of you might know the book Requiem, which was put together by Horst and Tim Page, with photos from all of the photographers who were killed during the war. And all of those photos are up in the museum now. They have a new, beautiful museum. But we also got to see some of the new Vietnam, including going to a high-tech center where they've hired an expert who worked for Google, Viet Q. Viet Q is a Vietnamese who was born in America. And they lured him back, and they're doing this incredible work on artificial intelligence, really trying to make Vietnam a high-tech center. So it was a great combination of the old and the new. And for me, of course, the saddest part was that so few of us came back because of course, the war was 50 years ago, and so many correspondents have passed away, but also physically, some others were not in a condition to make this event. So there were about 25 of us from some interesting countries. As you would expect, of course, the United States, France, Britain, Australia. There was a Romanian journalist. There was a Cambodian journalist. Nayan Chanda was there, a former member of this club from India. He was the editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, if some of you would remember. And he stayed after the fall of Saigon and covered the aftermath before he got kicked out. Anyway, I think that's long enough from me.
Okay, well, and I want to, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to come back and hear more about your experience when you were in Vietnam during the war. But first, I want to go to Case because, of course, one of the most iconic images from the days around the fall of Saigon was taken by the FCC's own Hugh van Es, of the people lined up to get on the helicopter in the final days of the war. And it's hanging downstairs, a replica is hanging downstairs in the bunker. Case, do you need a clicker or something to bring it up? Or?
So you want to go through them?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, you could tell us a bit about the background behind that photo.
The photos are just going in a loop, so you will see them passing by anyway. But I can, the background. First of all, I was not in the war in Vietnam. I've been in Vietnam only once, and that was very short for a small job. So I am here purely to represent the work from Hugh van Es. Especially the material he shot in Vietnam. The most famous photo of that is the helicopter. You see it passing by now and then. Of the helicopter, there are different versions, but there's one, this one, is always popping up. That's the one the agency started pushing, UPI at that time. There are about 9 variations after this one. No, not this, but you see one with 4. You see it every 10 seconds it changes, so it's just as well that don't worry about that. Here, see that the helicopter is leaving. There's 5 more or 4 more, and that is what he shot there. And then there's a few in color, like this one. This is the uncropped one. It means that it looks much wider. Also, the black and white shots are more like this, the origin, but have been cropped to make it a bit more focus on the helicopter and the people. Hugh, of course, I knew about this photo long before I knew Hugh. In Dutch, Hubert or Huip of Huub, there are many variations, but here in the FCC mostly it was or Hugh or Van Es or Veens. So the many variations. he became a very good friend of mine since I landed here in 1990 in the club. I mean, I was in Hong Kong since '89. And of course, we talked sometimes about his Vietnam years, but not only, because I was not a contemporary of that crowd, like the young lady next to me. But I got to know Annie, of course, through the years, and it often came up, but not in like we were endlessly talking about it. But one of the issues coming up regularly, and also just for some people here who might think that the helicopter is not going up or landing on the top of the American embassy in Saigon. Hugh himself managed to write, or managed when he got the access to write, a story about that in the New York Times 20 years ago, just to get that rumor or that story out of the window because he got sick and tired of it, because it never was the embassy, and he knew that always, and the original caption was right also, but somebody in the process, that happens sometimes, made it a bit more nice, and before you know, it sounds quite sexy. There were, of course, helicopters going up from the embassy terrain. That is a different story, but this was originally a building housing some CIA personnel and whatever. Apparently, it's still there. You mentioned Google as now being active in Vietnam in a wholly other way, but on Google Maps I saw they even have a special little sign for Pittman Apartments or something. Yeah, so you can still find it online also on the map. This picture, very well known. I knew it when I came from the Netherlands. I knew it had been a Dutch photographer, but it's purely because I was a photographer myself, so obviously I should be very stupid if I didn't know that. But I'd never met Hugh. So he became a good friend, etc. Now, another issue which sometimes bothered him, or because people asked about it, did it make him a millionaire? Now, Annie can tell more about that, but no, that was not the case. Hugh was on contract with them. That was like, it was so officially then not freelance. How that all really went in those days is difficult for me to totally visualize. But he got a little bonus of $100, and that was it. I am 100% sure I have remnants of his archive, including a lot of publications, especially all kind of publications in North America when there were still hundreds of different newspapers. And they, of course, were all subscribed to AP, and they all had that picture on the cover. And if this had been a freelance situation, it would have been a fantastic payday. But that's all we say about it. There's nothing more to say. But that was not the case. He didn't become a millionaire. But, he was still, here is you. One of the few photos I made in this loop. Is there something else I want to know? The other thing, and therefore I'm sitting here, he willed his material and his equipment, leftover equipment, to me in case he passed away. And that happened in 2009, so that's why I'm sitting here. I've gone through that material already quite a while ago. We had a big exhibition in the FCC a year after he passed away. And at the moment, all the material what we had from the office of Hugh in Annie's home is in Holland now. And I am literally talking with different candidates who are going to take it from me, because I don't want to get into a situation that somebody else has to save it from my archive when I'm not anymore there. So that is it in a short bit, how I get to this. So I'm a bit in a different position here. I'm a friend, a very good friend of Hugh, and I'm a photographer, but I never was a Vietnam photographer. That's, I think, for now, okay.
And I also wanted to ask, you said, because he's known for this photo, but this is far from the only thing that he did in Vietnam.
Sorry.
What other work, and I'd like to ask Annie about this too, what other work was he especially proud of, or do you think?
Well, add one thing that I was planning that, but then because of the loop, I didn't see it. There are some photos here, or at least one photo from Hamburger Hill, That was a place in Vietnam close to the border, I think, where there was immense battles, a lot of victims, a lot of casualties. And he actually went with a group of soldiers up there and photographed very strong material. You can find it when you just Google Hamburger Hill. You will get a lot of the material from him. And he was more proud of that than, I mean, proud in the sense, and I understand that as a photographer, he felt that was really what he wanted to show. And yeah, this is Hamburger Hill. Yeah. The helicopter image was, in a way, an accidental shot, in the sense that, of course not accidental, he was there and all that, but yeah, they were wondering why that little roof of the elevator shaft, why it had been strengthened with a metal plate a few days before, and they thought maybe, Horst Vaas said maybe, or well, not Horst, Oakley, Bert Oakley, the bureau chief, said, oh, maybe it is because they want to make it possible to land a helicopter on it, and that in the end happened, and that was this photo. Hugh happened to be on the premises. It was in their office. He had a 300mm lens available, so he could shoot these pictures. But that, if he had been outside, what he did in the morning, somewhere else in the city, he could never have made that photo. So that was it was not planned by him. That became, and I dare to say, and I don't like to use that word too often, that became the iconic image of the American departure, call it like that. Not the iconic image of the whole war, but definitely of the exit. And therefore, and in the loop you see a few cartoons, like this one, that image is still being used. Even now, this was a while ago when the Americans left Baghdad, the Iraq war. This was when they get into Nicaragua was the idea. This looks like a good place to land. So that image became, and this is very recent, when Rishi Sunak left the British government. It has nothing to do with America. The Big Ben and a scene from Vietnam in the Sunday Times. I was a bit surprised because actually not every younger person, also in Europe, knows anymore that image. So I was surprised they were still using it. Because everybody understands what a helicopter basically does, and when people want to get into it on a ladder. So the image is also constantly repeating itself. And it became iconic, and therefore then it gets a meaning separated from the original cause, the original place. And I find that quite fascinating how that works with some photos, but that's a whole other discussion. We can spend a whole other lunch on that. So that's it for now.
Okay. And Annie, you were in Vietnam with Hugh from, I think, 1969 to 1972. But you also saw it from this end in Hong Kong at the FCC, watching Correspondents covering the war from here. What can you tell us about your experiences with Hugh in Vietnam, what you saw at the FCC, and what Hugh thought about all of this?
Before I get into that, can I do a continuation of what Case was saying about me? Talk about the
Oh, maybe, yeah, just make sure to speak up.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I'd like to continue upon what Case was saying about the $100 bonus. I kept telling people, I used to tell people $150, and I found out it was only $100, which is... Anyway, and Hugh was, and why he didn't have the copyright. So that was also a familiar story because it happened 1 year before the copyright law came about. And, but Hugh never cared about money anyway, so he didn't give a damn. That was my department. But after nagging him for years, he did find an American lawyer who would take up this case on the contingency fee basis. And that was in right after 1995, when UPI had sold the photo library to Batman Archives, right? Yeah. So anyway, he found this lawyer, and letters back and forth. That was before email time. And then the photo library was resold, but this time to Corbis, and who's the owner of Corbis? Bill Gates.
Yeah.
So we immediately got a letter from the lawyer saying, I'm abandoning this case. because there is no chance of me winning, of us winning, over Bill Gates' money and his voluminous team of lawyers. So Hugh very happily gave up.
And to add, Bill Gates sold it a few years ago to the remnants of remnants, to Getty, the biggest image bank in the world, which has a very complicated ownership structure. I will not bore you with that. But you can imagine that it becomes incredibly difficult for people like us to fight anything like that.
So going back to your question, as I said, I arrived there in late '69, sort of, I think 6 days right after our wedding day. And till about '72. Now that time, I think that was a period when it was sort of still the war was still very much at its height, right? But Saigon in the years when I lived there was luckily far away from the battlefield, and there was a odd grenade thrown into cinemas, and I could hear every night the artillery sounds, which gave me nightmares every night. And then there's always the menace of the inebriated Vietnamese soldiers and policemen. But otherwise, it was a very livable and fun place. I mean, this was a place where all the foreign journalists, after about a week or more of hell in the battlefield, they would come back to Saigon, stinking with sweat. I mean, caked in mud, but shell-shocked, basically. But they were able to immediately forget about these things temporarily, though, over ice drinks and wine and French restaurants and such. I was never, of course, never in the field with Hugh, so I never experienced what he experienced. But these war buddies, he and his colleagues, competitors as well, they would sit together and they would like to relive and revisit all those horror scenes. And I was lucky enough to be always present, usually present in those circumstances, to hear about their shared danger, I suppose, and their close brushes of death or whatever you will. And most of all, actually, to get a feel of their camaraderie and their often used the term band of brotherhood and sisterhood, of course. Which reminds me, and it was during those circumstances, he was also very reticent about letting me know about his war stories. He didn't want me to know, basically. But as I say, I was always present when I was sitting there. They forget about me, basically, because they were so into their heads, into what had happened. And one of the things I will always remember was, and about the camaraderie and all that, was a plane crash that he was in that almost cost his life, and that was in Khe Sanh, long before my time. That was in 1968, March 1, and what I read was that it was almost like World War I scenario. It was so bad. But anyway, Hugh was in this C-123 plane that crashed upon takeoff, and they only had a few seconds to vacate the plane. I mean, most of them survived. All of them survived, sorry, some injured. But they only had a few seconds to vacate before the mortars came in and actually did destroy the plane. Now, Hugh was not one of the injured ones. There were 6 injured, I believe. But he was so shaken up that somebody gave him a canteen of whiskey, and he downed it in one gulp. And apparently somebody carried him to the bunker, and he woke up the next morning with a gigantic headache, and was told that he had slept through 1,200 rounds of artillery. Now, and then fast forward 35 years later, Hugh suddenly received an email from somebody who was apparently a companion, another passenger, a Special Forces Marine guy who tracked Hugh down on Google and to find out if that was the same Hugh van Es that was on the plane. And yes, of course, he was. And every March 1, they would exchange happy birthday emails, congratulating each other on their rebirth.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I didn't know that one. Yeah.
That's amazing.
What was
And Edie, you were there, I believe, around the same time. You arrived in.
I arrived in 72, and I was there in 72 and 73.
Okay.
The beginning of 72, the war was really escalating, but it was also the start of the peace negotiation, the Paris peace negotiations that Henry Kissinger and the North Vietnamese were involved in, and they kept going on and off and on and off. And I arrived in September, and in October, Henry Kissinger declared peace is at hand. And everybody thought the war was going to be over. And so everybody went off to do some story. And I suggested to our bureau chief that it would be really interesting to go talk to the pilots who were dropping all of these bombs. And the Navy actually arranged for me to go on the USS America, the aircraft carrier, to go talk to pilots who had been flying all of these deadly missions during the war. It was quite an experience. I mean, one of the funniest things is I arrived and I had to go down 9 flights of stairs to where I was staying, and there were no women, of course, in the Navy at that time. So I was staying in prison sick bay with a guard outside my door. And I went up to the pilot's ready room, and I look around, and in the back, there were all sorts of what should I say, risque photos and some models of women that sort of, I guess, gave them a lot of inspiration to go out there and return home. But that was followed by the big Christmas bombing campaign between 1972 and 1970, going into 1973. And in Saigon, which I'm sure Annie would remember, at the end of the year, they always did a light at the end of the tunnel, big party. That year, there was no light. 72 into 73, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. And I then went driving all the way up to Da Nang and beyond to talking to people. And none of the South Vietnamese thought the war was over or was going to end at all. Did I actually go out to these big battles? I did not. Did I go out and get shot at? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I remember going down to the Mekong Delta with Nicollet, and we were going to sort of do a more peacetime story, and then all of a sudden we were caught in the middle of a firefight, and we're both in a ditch, totally drenched in mud. So I also got to go and run the AP in Cambodia twice, and that was a very hot war at that time. And so I got to see the last American combat soldiers leave. That was an amazing story too, because when they announced that was going to happen, the word hadn't filtered out. So we went out to Tan Son Nhut, to the big airport base there, and we were actually telling some of these GIs that they were going to be going home. And they were, jumping, screaming. That was quite an experience. I also got to cover the release of prisoners of war who had been held by the Viet Cong in the South. And that was probably one of the most moving experiences of my time there, because they all came out so emaciated, dressed in almost rags, carrying almost nothing. And you really wondered, some of them had been there for 6 and 7 years. And at this reunion a week ago, there was one civilian who was teaching up near Dalat, and the 8 civilians were taken prisoners by the Vietnamese soldiers, moving sort of from the north to the south, and he was imprisoned for 8 months. And he came back. He was back. He's a lawyer now in the States, and a friend of one of my AP colleagues. And I went for drinks with him at the top of the Caravel Hotel, which that bar called Saigon Saigon is now listed in the United States as one of the top 20 best bars in the world.
And most expensive too.
Yeah. Anyway, it was very interesting listening to him talk about coming back, and he still loves Vietnam. So let me finish there.
Well, before I go into questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask about these reunions that, Edie, that you and Annie have been going to. At those reunions, do you all talk about the impact that these experiences had on you, and the impact of your work on how people saw the war, the impact of Hugh's work? How does this all look, looking back on it all these years later? And lastly, I understand there's also a good story about our former FCC president, Donald Wise, at one of these reunions.
Yes.
But yeah,
In the early reunions, the 20th, the 25th, the 30th, the guys, and I say the guys who were out in the field would sit down and have drinks and retell the stories that they remembered of being shot at,
Yeah.
escaping, and I think there was something very cathartic about that for all of them, because after 20 years, to be able to sit down with your fellow war correspondents and sort of relive things that you can't really talk to other people about and have them really understand. I think was a terrific, emotional and cathartic experience for a lot of them, as it was for me. When, as I said, that in those early reunions, it was either the 95 or I think it might have been the 2000, the 25th. Donald Wise, who was, as Jennifer said, a former president of this club, who looked like David Niven, he was British. And he thought it would be quite funny to go down to what they called Flag Street in Saigon and have a banner made which said in Vietnamese, "Hail, wonderful, terrific leader." Hail, and it was like the words, the same words in Vietnamese that they used for, no, hail something glorious leader. It was the same words that they used for the president of the country. So the internal...
Something leader. I may have that picture.
Yeah, hail...
Something leader. Yeah.
The glorious leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there was one other word. Anyway, doesn't matter. The internal security police came who were following what we were doing, even though for the government we were there as tourists.
Oh, he was taken to jail.
No, he was taken to the police station.
And
no, he was not. Since I was organizing this, I was called down to the police station also to explain what this was all about. And we came with the, it was like the manager of the hotel. I think we were at the Caravel then, but it was either the Caravel or the Continental. And the manager came with us to interpret. And I explained that we had all been here during the war, and it was the anniversary, and we were meeting to see the new Vietnam. And after about 2 hours, they let us go. So neither of us got to spend the night, the night in jail. But it was, I think we were a little more careful.
The next celebration.
No, I think like all FCC tales, it got a bit embellished.
Annie, did you have anything to add about the reunions or anything else?
Well, the only thing I could add was that as you were saying earlier on, I mean, Vietnam was the seminal experience of all their lives. I mean, you have to be in this band to understand what they went through. So we were basically outsiders, including the spouses, whom they loved very much, were basically kept outside of it. And because they felt we could not feel what they felt. And we understand that, yes. But during the reunions, I mean, they literally were, they were groups. They were just sitting aside. They would meet up in a restaurant or a bar or something, and their eyes are glazed, were glazed. I mean, they kept talking about what happened this and that day at this and that place or this and that hill. And you remember so-and-so who nearly died and so-and-so nearly got this and that, you know. And you know that they were not thinking of anybody else but that one scene in their head.
Could I add one thing? I wanted to make say something about women. There were women correspondents in Vietnam, really from the beginning of the war in 1964, 65. The AP was very late in sending me, but 9 American women, no, 8 American women and Kate Webb,
Yes.
who is from New Zealand
Zealand,
and
yeah.
Australia, wrote a book together called War Torn. This is the paperback copy. I'm one of the 9. And the interesting thing about the book is that it actually tells the story of the war from like 1965 through the fall of Saigon in 1975. So there's almost no overlapping. The stories are so different. Anyway, it was published in 2002 by Random House, and we've been trying for 20 years to have it made into a documentary or some kind of, and we've had like 8 options, all of which have not happened.
Well, hopefully the 9th one will.
Right.
Well, we have a few minutes left for questions. Do we want to start over here? And then Bobby.
Thanks, Mark Michelson. That was terrific, and great to have you back, Edie, after
Thank you.
a long time, and Annie, of course. I just wanted to follow up. You were the first, maybe one of the only female correspondents, other than the ones you mentioned, in Vietnam. Can you talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of being in that position? Because there had to be some benefits as well, but I'm sure a lot of it wasn't exactly like that.
Thank you for the question. I was the first woman for the AP full time, not the first woman. They're back there. They're in war torn. Listen, there certainly was an advantage in the sense that there were so few female correspondents in Vietnam, even in 1972. I mean, there were like 2 or 3 of us. So the good thing was that you could go and talk to any male in the military or civilian or government, and they'd be happy to talk to you. And you could also ask what I would consider sort of stupid military questions, saying, I really don't understand, why this is happening. Explain this to me. And they would be delighted to do that. Guys could not get away with that. I could get away. I could get away with doing that. But there's also the flip side of the coin that some males, military and otherwise, would try and take advantage of you, and it happened to me. And there's one big incident which I won't go through now because it's long, but it's in war torn.
Buddy?
Yeah, Annie, this is with you.
Oh, the microphone.
Oh, hi, thank you. Because Edie's exceptional, but so is Annie. There were not very many other wives or spouses with the correspondents, I think, in Saigon. Not many partners of the correspondents, right? I mean, you were quite exceptional as...
No,
there were a lot?
there were
Were there any non-Western women? Did you get shit?
non-Western.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there were a couple. No,
Yeah.
there were a lot of Vietnamese.
Isn't
Vietnamese
there a
wives.
funny story how they thought you were
There were a lot of
something-
Vietnamese wives.
They thought
there
you were
were-
something else?
If it's
Hella Blystone,
Yeah.
Toby Pyle,
yeah, but
West Americans.
Yeah.
mostly Americans, yes.
Right, but didn't you have funny experiences where people thought
Because I have that sort of, when I was young, I had that sort of looks that if I was in Vietnam, they would think I was Vietnamese. I was in Thailand, they would talk to me in Thai. Philippines, I would be a Filipina. Hong Kong was the only place where they spoke to me in English. Because I happened to have this very long hair and heavily made up, And so walking around Saigon, I used to get umbrellas poked at me, and hot soup poured over me by these inebriated soldiers and policemen that I was talking about earlier on. And once there was, it was night time, and but it was before curfew, and it was right in front of our apartment building, and there was this drunken, I forgot whether it was white mice, we called the policemen white mice then, or a soldier had a gun, had a congee poured over me. So Hugh immediately went up to confront this guy, and then this guy pulled a gun on Hugh. But luckily I had this woman, she and the whole family is sleeping on the floor of our foyer, of our building. And she came out and actually stood between the drunken soldier and Hugh. I mean, and pushed us, back into their building and said, just go, go, go. And she was the one that actually put her life in line to save us. Is that what you were?
Yeah, absolutely. But can I have a little supplementary thing? Because you mentioned that you were allowed on the carrier. And of course, the whole point about journalists, war correspondents in Vietnam, was that you had a kind of level of access to the story that has probably not really been possible since. That, you didn't have to be embedded with this or that military. You could just go to those battlefields and cover it. And that's quite an exceptional moment in journalistic time. Am I right or wrong?
It definitely is, and having covered quite a number of wars since Vietnam was, at least for me, the first and only war where journalists had free rein to go anywhere. If there was a seat on a helicopter, you could get on, you could go out to the field for a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks. If there was a space coming back, you could get on. The US military wanted journalists to see what was going on. And what happened was that I'm sure some of you have heard of the 5 o'clock follies, which was the military's daily briefing to journalists. And what really ended up happening was that there was a huge disconnect between what journalists, my colleagues, and everybody else was seeing in the field and what the military was saying at the 5 o'clock follies. Because what the journalists were reporting from the field was basically much more negative than what the military was reporting at the 5 o'clock follies. So the follies ended up being terribly contentious. And I'm sure that for any of you who've read a history of the war, the US military blamed the media for losing the war.
Oh, yeah.
Walter Cronkite, who was the CBS correspondent, basically was seen then as sort of the oracle of
Evil.
the evil,
Yeah.
right, for basically not reporting the US military's line. So yes, the US military after Vietnam totally wanted to control all the media that they ever took anywhere. And just as a quick aside, the first US military adventure after that was The Mouse That Roared War in Grenada.
Oh, yeah.
And they took a whole pool to Grenada, press pool, and those people never saw anything, nothing. The people who had gone in on their own and, gotten other ways to get in. They were the only ones who reported it. And the first Gulf War, where I was running the AP in Saudi Arabia, you had to go minders out in the field before, and then there were pools for the war itself, which was a 24-day air war and a 4-day ground war. And I still remember interviewing an Air Force general sitting there, and his PR person was standing behind me doing either okay or no.
We are over time, but if you all don't mind staying for a couple more minutes, we could combine the last two questions. Say Philip, and did we have any questions over here? No? Yes, and so we could combine these two questions and then wrap up. Yeah, and then over to Philip.
Just on the subject of women at the end of the war, Narayan Chandra's wife, Geeta, was there all through 74 and until after he left in 75, after the Fall of Saigon. And I think she got pregnant there, actually, if you really want to know. My question is, when did Hugh actually leave, and on what did he leave? And my third point is more of a comment as to whether, and I was there in the last few weeks of the war until shortly before the end, the sense of bitterness of the South Vietnamese.
All right, and then let's take one last question over there, and then we'll combine those. Yeah.
Well, Hugh left a month after the fall. I keep calling it the fall, right? Not the liberation. On June 1st, via Vientiane. He was asked to leave.
And I just, in answering your question, when I went back with Horst and in 1993, I wrote a story for the Far Eastern Economic Review. And the lead to the story was basically how shocked I was that there was so little anti-Americanism. And every 5 years, it's gotten less and less. In going back for the 50th, nothing at all.
And finally,
the only thing I got asked about was, there's a lot of concern about Donald Trump and the 46% tariffs that the United States has imposed on Vietnam.
And last question over here.
Just a question about the journalists who might have been embedded in the military. And I'm thinking about Good Morning Vietnam, and how realistic was that, or was it pure fiction?
What's interesting is that the first story I wrote in Vietnam was about armed forces radio, and I actually interviewed the two guys who did the morning show. Look, Robin Williams, a movie is a movie, and reality is not quite. But the idea for the movie was really there. I mean, the military was trying to be very positive and, gin up all of these soldiers to do their best and fight.
Yes, I think, Edie, you wanted to end with a few words.
Yeah. At every reunion, we have done a toast to absent friends. And in Vietnam, the absent friends are
Expanded.
our colleagues who were killed during the war, and our colleagues who have passed away since and are not with us today. And I thought it would be really nice if you all could raise a glass to absent friends.
Absent friends.
Absent friends. And one last small toast that applies to everybody in this room, to freedom of the press.
Thank you all again so much for being here today. This has been great, and thank you all for coming. I won't keep you any longer. Just a reminder that if you are not a member of the FCC and you enjoyed this event today, you are more than welcome to apply to become a member. There should be some information at your seats. And if you are a member and you know someone who should be a member, please put an application in their hands. There's a $2,000 F&B credit in it for you if you get them to join. And a reminder also that we have an election underway for the FCC Board of Governors. The deadline to vote, I believe, is May 22nd. Please do vote. It's important to have a say in who represents you. And I believe that's it. So thank you all again, and have a great day.